Colonialism, one word, and a multitude of images flash before your eyes. The grand plans of empires, the division of a continent as if it were a chessboard. You hear the words Africa, colonies, 19th century, conquests. What comes to mind? Perhaps the majestic expansion of the British Empire. Or maybe the scramble for the Congo, where Portugal and Belgium were determining the fate of millions. But today, we have a different story. It's much less known, but no less intriguing. It intertwines the ambitions of a young nation dreaming of establishing itself among colonial giants and the proud independence of an ancient feudal kingdom ready to fight to the end. Here, the focus isn't on grand plans for conquering a continent, but on a small mistake. Yes, a translation error. And it will become the trigger for one of the most dramatic and unexpected military campaigns of the late 19th century. Roman intrigues, daring political maneuvers in the heart of Africa, brutal battles, and a disgraceful defeat that changed the plans of an entire empire. Let's give some attention to the context. Ethiopia, under the leadership of Johannes IV, is engaged in a bloody struggle with the Mahdists, radical tribes from Sudan, led by Muhammad Ahmad, a self-proclaimed messiah. He aims to liberate Sudan from the Turco-Egyptian and British colonizers, and Ethiopia from foreign influence. Johannes was not just a military leader, he was a true symbol of resilience and courage for his nation. However, in politics and war, as in chess, sometimes one mistake can cost everything. On March 10th, 1889, in one of the last battles with the Mahdists, Emperor Johannes dies, and the Ethiopian army, which had just claimed victory, suddenly descends into chaos. Without a strong leader and centralized power, the country becomes vulnerable. This creates a perfect situation for external forces to intervene. Enter Italy, which had already, in 1882, seized the strategically important port of Assab on the Red Sea coast, and in 1885, with British consent, gained control over the port of Massawa, the only Ethiopian outlet to the sea. The reasons for such an alliance between Britain and Italy are simple. Both countries, being part of the Triple Alliance, sought to weaken French influence in the region and strengthen their positions on trade routes. It is important to clarify, at the time of these events, Italy was not yet recognized as a full-fledged colonial power, and its desire for expanding its influence led to its active policy in Africa. After Johannes's death and the transition of power to Menelik II, Italy, wasting no time, begins to actively advance into the interior of Ethiopia. The Italians quickly seize territory along the coast and start using Menelik as an ally in the power struggle. A few years later, Italy declares Eritrea its first colony, opening a new chapter in the history of African colonization. Menelik, who had long claimed the imperial throne, actively employs political maneuvers. His secret agreements with Italy, including those in 1883 and 1887, gradually bolster his position but ultimately lead to a tragic mistake for Ethiopia. The most crucial moment will be the Treaty of Wuchale in 1889, which was supposed to strengthen Ethiopia and its sovereignty. But an error in translation results in Ethiopia effectively losing its independence, while Italy gains a protectorate. So what was wrong with this treaty that became a stumbling block in the relations between Ethiopia and Italy? Let's delve a little deeper into this fascinating story. Any treaty needs to be given legal force. Today, you and I can confirm the legality of a document, or in legal terms, ratify it from anywhere in the world. But in the 19th century, it required a personal meeting with representatives of the parties. This story is no exception. When, in July 1889, Mechanin embarked on the Italian ship Colombo with Pietro Antonelli to head to Rome, the emperor's brother understood the significance of the moment. Thus, alongside the Italian national flag on the foremast, the Ethiopians hung their green-yellow-red national flag with a lion in the middle. By August 21st, the Ethiopian delegation landed in Naples, Italy. It was the first time that Africans were welcomed as equals to Europeans. Officials from the cabinet were present at the Naples port, and Mekonnen and his entourage were housed in a palace. Imagine the cultural shock and delight of the Ethiopians, who for the first time experienced such treatment. Try to envision the anticipation and high expectations the Ethiopian representatives had for an alliance with Rome. That same summer, Mekonnen met with the King of Italy, Umberto, who ratified the treaty. However, what seemed like a respectful agreement was deceptively malicious. While Mekonnen toured Italy, Italian troops advanced further into the heart of Ethiopia, into Asmara and the surrounding regions up to the Mareb River. Since the new Emperor Menelik urgently needed weapons and money to maintain power within the country and prevent the European powers from tearing it apart, he agreed for Mekonnen to sign an additional agreement to the Treaty of Wuchala. According to this agreement, all Ethiopian territories occupied by Italian troops at the time of the signing would be ceded to Italy, in exchange for a loan of 4 million lira, half of which Menelik received immediately, and the other half as credit for the purchase of weapons in Italy. Effectively, Menelik sold parts of northern Ethiopia to strengthen his state. But Italy took much more than he anticipated. But this wasn't the last trick from the Italians. According to the Treaty of Wuchala, the document was written in 2 languages, Italian and Amharic, Ethiopian, and both versions were supposed to be equal. This was true for every part of the treaty except for Article 17. Here is where the crucial translation error lay. The very word that started a whole war and led to a series of incredible twists and outcomes. In the Ethiopian version of Article 17, Ethiopia had the right to use Italy's services in diplomatic contacts with other countries. In the Italian version, the word right was replaced with obligation. This effectively meant that Italy represented Ethiopia on the international stage, and Italo-Ethiopian relations took on the character of a protectorate. Thus, under the Wuchale Treaty, Ethiopia lost its independence and came under Italy's influence. Since no one in Europe understood Amharic and did not take Ethiopia seriously, the jubilant Italians hastily informed all European powers in October 1889 that Ethiopia now belonged to them. In 1890, the unsuspecting Menelik sent enthusiastic letters to European leaders, announcing his coronation as Emperor of Ethiopia, expecting that Ethiopia and he would now be recognized as the independent and strongest power in Africa. However, he received replies from only 2 countries, Britain and Germany, and it was unlikely to please Menelik. Both powers politely informed Emperor Menelik that according to Article 17 of the Treaty of Wuchal, all contacts with them must henceforth be conducted only through Italy. Realizing that the Italians had deceived him, Menelik quickly assured everyone that there was a translation error and that he did not intend to adhere to such conditions. On September 26, 1890, Menelik wrote a letter to King Umberto of Italy, stating that he agreed to use Italy's services as a diplomatic intermediary, only when he wished and did not consider himself obligated to act solely in that manner. In response, Italy again sent Pietro Antonelli to Menelik's court, instructing him to do everything possible, even to sacrifice part of the newly acquired territory in Ethiopia, but to maintain the protectorate over Ethiopia. Antonelli threatened Menelik with war if he rejected the Treaty of Wuchala, to which the emperor's wife, Taitu, told the Italian envoy that no one in Ethiopia was afraid to die for their homeland and would consider it an honor. The negotiations predictably failed, Antonelli departed, and Menelik sent a letter to all European leaders, which can be regarded today as a bold anti-colonial statement. I do not intend to be an indifferent spectator while foreign powers appear with the intention of carving their empires in Africa. Ethiopia, for 14 centuries, has been an island of Christians among a sea of pagans. Since the Almighty has protected Ethiopia to this day, I am confident that He will protect her and assist in her growth in the future. I have no doubt that He will not allow her to be divided among other states. Thus, on February 27, 1893, Emperor Menelik of Ethiopia denounced, that is, formally rejected, the terms of the international agreement, annulled the Treaty of Wuchala, and returned to Italy the sum of 4 million lira he had borrowed. Despite the fact that slow negotiations continued until 1894, it was clear to both Menelik and the Italians that war was inevitable. And finally, the war. A war between a country striving for strength and independence and a country whose colonial ambitions prevent it from simply leaving the situation as it is. The first strike was unsurprisingly dealt by the Italians in 1895, when they seized the northern kingdom of Tigray. On January 13th of the same year, the forces of Ethiopians and Italians clashed in the Battle of Koatit. While the Ethiopians outnumbered their enemy 3-1, 12,000 against 4,000 Italians, they were poorly equipped. They had almost no artillery, and their weapons were outdated and significantly inferior to the enemy in both quality and quantity. The Italians, on the other hand, fought with modern rifles and artillery. And this immediately became a decisive factor. Despite suffering 95 killed and 229 wounded, the Italians achieved a clear victory, with the Ethiopians losing around 1,500 men. It seemed clear: a small, poorly equipped army against a powerful European force. The advantage was obvious. However, as you might already suspect, the Ethiopians did not intend to surrender. Menelik II, the new emperor of Ethiopia, although not as powerful as the Italians, understood the advantage of Italy's armament over the outdated equipment used by the Ethiopian forces. Let's skip over the less significant events and move to the moment when the military situation drastically changed. By 1896, Menelik had managed to assemble an army of 100,000 men, equipped with 70,000 rifles and even artillery, 42 guns of various calibers and types, including French ones. But how did Ethiopia acquire such modern weaponry? The fact is, during the period when Europe was actively dividing Africa, France, and the Russian Empire, Britain's eternal rivals and its allies became some of the most important suppliers of arms to Ethiopia. This was not a coincidence. The French, eager to bolster their influence in the region and support Ethiopia as a counterbalance to the growing Italian threat, willingly supplied modern weapons, from new rifles and ammunition to artillery guns and shells. Speaking of rifles, the French supplied Lebel and Veterli rifles, which were among the most advanced at the time. To give you an idea of how much France desired Ethiopia's victory, the Lebel rifles were so new that they were in short supply even within France itself. The Russians aided Ethiopia for several reasons besides their rivalry with Britain. First, Ethiopia was the only Orthodox Christian state in Africa, which naturally earned the sympathy of the Russian government. Secondly, the Russian Empire viewed the young Italy as a competitor on the international stage and sought to weaken its position. The Russians sent arms in the form of Berdan rifles, ammunition, and other items that could be useful. However, it should be noted that the Russian arms supply was much smaller due to the difficulty of transporting them to Ethiopia. Nevertheless, they sent volunteers, including military doctors and engineers, who helped the Ethiopian army with preparations, trained them in artillery and weapon use, taught them tactics, and provided medical assistance. Among the Ethiopian people, the Russians would be remembered for a long time as friends, gaining tremendous respect from the local population, partly due to military doctors saving hundreds of lives. So, preparations for new battles were almost complete. All that remained was to lead the people and gather as many troops as possible to oppose the Italians, who were already confidently assured of their victory. In his address to the people, Menelik declared, "Every man capable of bearing arms must be ready to defend his land." This was a serious statement, and as he prepared for a decisive blow, Menelik began gathering forces to show the Italians that they had overestimated their strength and celebrated victory too early. While the Italians continued their advance, capturing cities like Mekelle and Adwa, he announced mobilization. Thus, he assembled the largest army in Ethiopian history at that time, a force of about 100,000 warriors, dare I say soldiers, armed not with spears and shields, but with modern arms by the standards of that time. Italian Remingtons, Gras rifles, Russian Burdons, German Mausers, and the latest French Lebel rifles. It even included women, which was a significant rarity at the time. They rescued the wounded on the battlefield, acted as scouts, and assisted in the camps. Menelik created not just an army, he reinvented and unified the entire Ethiopian nation from a fragmented feudal state with different tribes and religions. Ethiopia, in a short time, transformed into a unified, almost monolithic force ready to repel the invaders. As Menelik wrote to Ethiopian Muslim leaders, calling them to war against Italy, "I am black and you are black, so let us unite to fight a common enemy together." Everything was ready for a battle that would change the course of events and finally establish the status quo in Ethiopia. The entire African world held its breath in anticipation of the decisive battle, a battle of one of the last countries that had not yet become a colony and served as an inspiration, offering hope for decolonization and faith that Africa could be independent from the European giants who had conquered the rest of the world. Menelik set out with his army of 100,000 from the imperial capital, Addis Ababa, on October 11, 1895. Outwardly, it resembled a crusade. Tens of thousands of Ethiopians marched to reclaim the sacred city of Adwa and drive the enemy into the sea. The first clash occurred on December the 7th, when the vanguard of Menelik's army, numbering 30,000, encountered the initial Italian forces under the command of Pietro Toselli, who numbered 2,000, three-quarters of whom were Ethiopian askaris, mercenary soldiers recruited by the Italians from among the local inhabitants of the occupied territories. Mekonnen, the emperor's brother who commanded the vanguard, ordered Toselli to surrender. In response, he received a message stating, "Today you will destroy your 7-year work," directly alluding to Mekonnen's crucial role in the diplomatic ties between Italy and Ethiopia when he had arrived to finalize a treaty with Italy. Just imagine Mekonnen's fury upon receiving this message. His anger was swift, propelling the army into battle. When Toselli saw the true scale of the disaster, thousands of Ethiopian soldiers arriving in an endless stream, he wrote to the command requesting reinforcements. However, the messenger never delivered the message, as the Ethiopians encircled the Italians. The initial advantage of the Italians, occupying the flat-topped mountain of Amba, quickly turned into their primary weakness. While it was easy to fire on the Ethiopians climbing the mountain when it came time to retreat, the Italians tumbled down the mountain along with their artillery. Naturally, there was no talk of an organized retreat. The Battle of Amba Alagi swiftly turned into a massacre. Toselli's army was annihilated, as was he himself. While Toselli's men were falling to Ethiopian rifle fire and spear thrusts, Oreste Baratieri, the commander of the Italian forces in Africa, hurriedly reinforced the army, trying to bolster it with more men and weapons. Between December 1895 and January 1896, 11 ships carrying reinforcements and arms arrived at the Italian port of Massawa, with another 6,500 soldiers expected in February. Baratieri needed time, which was running out as Menelik's army drew ever closer. The next obstacle for the Emperor of Ethiopia, which was meant to help the Italians buy time, was the fortress at Mekelle and its 1,200 defenders under the command of Giuseppe Galliano. For Galliano and his men, the situation was extremely tense. After the Battle of Amba, survivors, though severely wounded askaris, began arriving at the fortress. Sitting by the fire, Galliano saw people in tatters gradually coming into the light, some with horrifying wounds from castration, an ancient warrior custom practiced by the Ethiopians on their enemies. The Italians, for whom such customs were barbaric, were simply terrified by the looming threat. As Menelik's forces approached, tension and fear hung heavily over the fortress. On December 19th, the first Ethiopian forces arrived at the fortress in Mekelle, beginning a prolonged siege. Mekonnen once again tried to persuade the Italians to surrender. He wrote a letter to Galliano. "In the name of my emperor, I ask you to leave this land, or else I will be forced to start a war. It pains me to have to shed Christian blood. Please leave and take your soldiers with you. Your friend, Mekonnen." Galliano, like his predecessor, refused. By January 6th, The fortress was completely encircled. Tens of thousands of Ethiopians surrounded Mekele, but they struggled to capture the fort. The firepower of their artillery was insufficient to breach the walls, and the deep moats around the fortress forced the Ethiopian infantry to attack at a narrow point by the main gate, where Italian rifles and cannons cut them down like a shooting gallery. The Italians were already anticipating another victory, but everything changed when the Ethiopians managed to block the fort's defenders from accessing their two only water sources outside the walls, which they had been using at night. Ethiopian chronicles claim that this was the idea of Taitu, the emperor's wife. Galliano was forced to raise the white flag and surrender. Under escort by Ethiopian soldiers, he left Mekele on January 20th. Baratieri had almost no time left. The last barrier separating Baratieri and the Ethiopian army had been breached. After the siege of Mekele, the Ethiopian army advanced toward Adwa, bypassing the fortified Italian fort at Adigrat. General Oreste Baratieri, with the main Italian forces, hurried to follow. Neither side dared to engage the other in a decisive battle. Menelik, having learned from the experiences at Amba Elagi and Mekele, understood that attacking the Italians would mean engaging them where they could best defend themselves. At the same time, Baratieri hesitated to attack, fearing defeat and the consequent destruction of the Italian colony of Eritrea. It seemed an eternal waiting game ensued, each side hoping for the other to make a mistake and attack first. But someone had to make a decision to fight, even if not willingly. While Baratieri was waiting, his supplies dwindled. The delivery of new provisions was hampered by an active guerrilla network that organized attacks on caravans. They were not welcomed in occupied Tigray, and moreover, Baratieri was under pressure from Italy's Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, who urged him to take action, as well as from his brigade generals. After consulting with his subordinates on the night of February 29, 1896, Baratieri made the difficult and fateful decision to attack the Ethiopians. In making this decision, he relied primarily on the optimistic racism and confidence of his subordinates, who claimed that as soon as the Italian army appeared on the horizon, the Ethiopians would immediately scatter. Additionally, spies from the Ethiopian camp, actually agents of Menelik himself, convinced Baratieri that the Ethiopian army was on the verge of collapse, and that several kings, including Emperor Menelik's brother Mekonnen, would betray him at the decisive moment of battle. Baratieri's plan was simple. He wanted to catch the Ethiopians by surprise. 3 columns under the command of his generals were to take the high ground near Adwa by night, with 1 reserve column behind. General Dabormida's right column was to occupy the pass between Mount Eske and Mount Rajo. General Albertone's left column, the southern pass between Mount Rajo and Mount Samayata, and General Aramondi's central column was to position itself at Mount Rajo. Baratieri believed that when the Ethiopians woke up and saw an entire army right under their noses, they would have 2 choices: either retreat in disgrace, potentially undermining Menelik's legitimacy and leading to his being overthrown, or attack the fortified Italian positions on the high ground in desperation, suffering significant losses. Both outcomes were favorable for the Italians. The plan was thwarted by haste, foolishness, vanity, incompetence, or perhaps all of these combined. The first mistake made by the Italians was that Albertoni's column, for some unknown reason, rushed ahead, leaving the other Italian forces far behind. Opinions vary widely as to why this occurred. Some say it was a mix of vanity, underestimation of the Ethiopian army, and distrust of Baratieri. Others speculate that it was due to a mistake by Baratieri, who believed that the position Albertona was supposed to occupy was called Kidan Merit, which was actually much further away, as the guides informed Albertone. Regardless, Albertone found himself isolated from the main forces and, through his actions, opened a gap in the tightly knit Italian defense. When Baratieri heard distant gunfire and realized Albertoni's dire situation, he sent Dabormida's column to cover the forces ahead. Here, the Italians made a second fatal mistake. It is unclear why this happened, perhaps due to poor knowledge of the terrain, but instead of aiding Albertone, Dabormida led his forces significantly northward, making a wrong turn. He turned right at the fork instead of left. From that moment, the Italian army was laid bare in the palm of Menelik's hand, and he needed only to clench the Ethiopian nation's fist to crush the Italians, who were scattered across the mountains and isolated from each other. Albertoni's vanguard encountered the Ethiopians early in the morning, around 7 o'clock. What began as a typical skirmish soon turned into a disaster. The unit was nearly annihilated. Realizing the severity of the situation, Albertone attempted to secure a position on the eastern heights, but there was little hope for salvation. The Ethiopians, having positioned cannons on the Endakidane hill directly opposite the Italian positions, unleashed a barrage of fire upon them. Menelik's artillery tore through the Italian lines, turning any attempt at resistance into a desperate flight. By 11 in the morning, it was all over. The vanguard column had ceased to exist, and Albertone himself was captured. Meanwhile, panic reigned in the center of the Italian positions. Baratieri, watching his Eritrean askari flee, realized that things were going very badly. Albertoni's column was destroyed, and Dabormida's column, which was supposed to come to the rescue, appeared to have been routed as well. He could only speculate what catastrophe would next befall his positions. The irony was that Dabormida, one of the few still resisting, was surrounded on all sides. Even as his soldiers began to retreat, he remained on the battlefield, hoping at least to cover their withdrawal. By the evening of March 1st, he finally gave the order to retreat, unaware that the main Italian forces had already been defeated and scattered by noon. When Dabormida fell, struck by an Ethiopian bullet, he still believed he was fighting for the survival of his army. Pursued by Ethiopian cavalry, the remnants of the Italian army fled in chaotic disorder. Panic swept everything away. Soldiers abandoned their weapons, ammunition, and even their comrades. The detachments that attempted to cover the retreat were quickly destroyed or simply dissolved into the chaos. General Arimondi of the Central Column also fell on the battlefield before reinforcements arrived. The Italian army lost its discipline. No one listened to commands. Everyone was trying to save themselves. On the battlefield and during the retreat, the Italians lost a total of 6,133 men killed, including about 2,000 Ethiopian askaris. Another 1,428 were wounded, 470 Italians, and 958 Ethiopian askaris. This was the largest defeat of Europeans by local forces in Africa. It was simply a disaster from which it is impossible to recover. On March 3rd, Baratieri sent a telegram to Rome informing the government of the defeat. After this, military actions practically ceased. The major victory of the Ethiopian army thwarted the Italian leadership's plans to expand its colonial empire on the African continent. Baratieri himself was put on trial, but was acquitted in June of the same year. The disaster at Adwa sent a terrifying echo throughout Italy. While pro-Republican, anti-colonial members of the Italian parliament proposed initiatives to completely abandon Africa, the streets were filled with crowds of discontented people. Students and workers shouted, "Viva Menelik!" "Death to the deputies!" and "Hands off Africa!" Demonstrators attacked the office of Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, a supporter of colonial policy, pelting its windows with stones. And they ransacked the editorial office of the newspaper La Tribuna, known for its support of Crispi's policies. Demonstrations and acts of resistance took place in all major Italian cities, with Rome being hit the hardest. In the capital, theaters, universities, and hospitals had to be closed temporarily due to the protests. Italian army protected officials and government buildings. At the same time, in Pavia, anti-colonialists built barricades across railroad tracks to prevent the dispatch of reinforcements to Africa. 2 days after the defeat at Adwa, Crispi's cabinet of ministers resigned. The situation was so unstable that the English newspaper The Times feared that the relatively recently unified Italy might fall apart again. After the fall of Crispi's government, The Times wrote, "While the unrest in Rome naturally arises from the deep distress with which the sensitive people receive the news of the great disaster, there are threats of disturbances in other parts of Italy that are more alarming in their nature. In Sicily, there is chronic discontent, which, it should be remembered, was not so long ago suppressed by Signor Crispi. His fall under such deplorable circumstances will undoubtedly be a great incentive to all lawless elements. Therefore, all friends of Italy must hope that, whether under the direction of the Marquis di Rudini, the Prime Minister after Crispi, or anyone else, a government may quickly be formed that is capable of steadily upholding the authority of the law. On the night of March 6th, a report came to the newspaper office that demonstrators had killed Francesco Crispi. However, on the next morning, March 7th, the Times happily reported that the news of the murder had turned out to be false. The good name of the Italian people was not dishonored in the hour of trial by the crime of a frenzied mob. In Venice, a certain Antonio Vigo launched a petition urging Parliament to return Eritrea to Africans. The colony, Vigo declared, destroys the dignity, the welfare of the people, and the good name of Italy. Italy should want for Africa the same as it wants for itself, freedom from foreign hegemony. Leave Africa to the Africans, Vigo urged. Anti-colonial movements in Italy existed even during the signing of the Treaty of Wuchale, but now public unrest was at its peak, and the people were ready to tear things apart. As a result of all the aforementioned actions, we arrive at the following. The news of the defeat in Ethiopia led to Baratieri's trial, the resignation of the Italian government, and a significant increase in the military presence in Eritrea, with the number of troops raised to 40,000. However, the Italians no longer attempted to attack Ethiopian territories. The Italian government entered into peace negotiations with Menelik II, with diplomatic support organized by the Russian Empire. On October 26, 1896, a peace treaty was signed in Addis Ababa, under which Italy recognized the independence of Ethiopia and its borderline, and also agreed to pay reparations. The northern border of Ethiopia, established by this treaty, remains in place to this day. The Battle of Adwa became an outstanding symbol of Pan-Africanism and ensured the sovereignty of Ethiopia for decades to come. March 2nd is a national holiday in Ethiopia, celebrated in honor of the victory over the Italian forces in 1896. For Italy, however, it was akin to a disgrace, which Benito Mussolini would attempt to erase by starting the Second Italo-Ethiopian War in the mid-1930s.